The high desert plains of the New Mexico territory were a place where the wind carved sculptures from sandstone, and the air tasted of dust and regret. It was a land that held its secrets tight, burying them under a sky so vast and empty it could swallow a man's soul whole. Rhett Callahan understood this land because he was made of the same stuff, weathered quiet, and haunted by things best left buried. For 9 years he had lived in a state of self-imposed exile, a ghost in his own life, his only companions, the silence of his cabin, and the memory of a daughter's laughter. He rode toward the town of Bod, not for justice or redemption, but for a simple debt. An old acquaintance, a rancher named Elias, had his life savings stolen by a slick bounty hunter called Silas Kane, a man who preferred taking from the desperate over chasing the dangerous. Rhett had given his word, and his word even after 9 years of rust was still iron. He was tracking Kane not as a lawman, for that part of him had died with his daughter, but as a man settling a score. His horse, a stoic gray gelding named Ghost, moved with a steady ground-eating gait. The sun beat down a merciless hammer on the anvil of the earth. Bod emerged from the heat haze, slowly a collection of tired wooden buildings, hunkered down, as if bracing for a blow. It was a town Rhett knew, but no longer recognized. The familiarity was a dull ache in his chest, a reminder of the life he had abandoned. He'd been sheriff here once a lifetime ago. He rode down the dusty main street, his eyes scanning the saloon, the livery, the general store. He spotted Kane's distinctive black mare hitched outside the saloon, and a cold certainty settled over him. This would be quick. He had no interest in lingering in this place of ghosts. He guided Ghost toward the alley beside the saloon, planning his approach, when he turned the corner onto the town square. And the world stopped. Everything, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the lazy buzz of flies, the very breath in his lungs froze. There, in the dead center of the square, was a sight so brutal it defied the harsh logic of the desert. A young woman was bound to a thick wooden beam, a makeshift pillory for all to see. She was stripped of everything but a torn white dress that hung from her skeletal frame like a shroud. Her arms were stretched wide, lashed to the crossbeam with coarse rope that had rubbed her skin raw. A tapestry of bruises, black and purple, bloomed across her ribs and down her thighs. Her legs dangled lifelessly, her bare feet caked in a mixture of dirt and dried blood. The sun didn't just burn her skin. It branded her humiliation into the very dust of the town. And the town was silent. Storekeepers swept their porches, turning their backs to the square. Curtains twitched in windows, eyes peering out before vanishing. The new sheriff, a man Rhett barely knew, stood in the shade of his office, polishing a badge that reflected nothing but his own cowardice. They all saw her, and every one of them looked away. Rhett's mission, Silas Kane the debt. It all evaporated, turning to smoke in the furnace of what he was seeing. This wasn't justice. This was a lynching in slow motion, a communal act of forgetting a person while they were still alive. He dismounted his movements, stiff, his gaze locked on the girl. She couldn't have been more than 20. Her head was bowed, a curtain of matted brown hair hiding her face. She looked so small, so utterly broken. Then he saw it. Around her neck, resting against the hollow of her throat, was a small wooden cross crudely carved by hand. Rhett's heart seized in his chest, a fist of ice closing around it. It was identical to the one he had carved for his daughter Lily the winter before she died. He could still feel the grain of the pine wood under his thumb, the careful way he'd sanded the edges so they wouldn't splinter. Lily had never taken it off. He took a step forward, the dust muffling his bootfalls. The girl must have heard him, or perhaps felt the shift in the air, the sudden focus of his attention. She lifted her head, and for a moment her eyes met his. They were hollowed out, devoid of hope, but in their depths a flicker of something remained, a stubborn ember refusing to be extinguished. Her lips, cracked and swollen, barely moved. They all watched me die, she whispered, her voice a dry rasp, a sound meant for no one but the dust. That was all she said. But Rhett saw the truth in her eyes. It wasn't the look of a thief or a sinner. It was the look of a survivor cornered and condemned by a town that had sacrificed its soul for the sake of convenience. It was the same look he saw in the mirror every morning. And in that instant, the 9 years of silence, of running from the man he used to be, came to a crashing end. He looked from her broken form to the silent watching windows, and a cold, clear purpose settled over him. The past was never dead. It wasn't even past. And sometimes it reached out and demanded a reckoning. He strode forward, his hand going not for his gun, but for the hunting knife on his belt. The town could have its silence. He was about to give them something to be silent about. The scrape of Rhett's blade against the thick rope was the loudest sound Bod had heard all day. It was a sharp, decisive sound that cut through the oppressive quiet, making heads turn and conversations die in the saloon. He sliced through the bindings on her wrists with 2 swift motions, the fibers parting with a sigh. Her body, deprived of support, dropped forward into him. She was limp, terrifyingly light, as if she were made of dry leaves and brittle bones. There was no scream, no cry of relief, just the dead weight of a soul that had been left to rot in plain sight. He caught her, his arm instinctively wrapping around her waist to keep her from collapsing into the dust. He could feel the tremor in her limbs, the shallow, ragged catch of her breath. He pulled his duster from his saddle, a heavy canvas coat that smelled of trail dust and leather, and draped it around her shoulders. She didn't resist, didn't even flinch. She simply stood there, leaning against him, a forgotten thing someone had finally decided to pick up. The whole town watched. From behind their curtains, from the dark mouths of alleys, from the swinging doors of the saloon, they watched. Silas Kane, his target, even stepped out onto the boardwalk, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand, a look of bemused curiosity on his face. But no one moved to stop Rhett. No one spoke a word. This was what guilt looked like, when it hid in plain sight, a collective cowardice that held them all paralyzed. Rhett lifted her onto Ghost's saddle. She sagged against the worn leather, her head lolling, her eyes half shut. He swung up behind her, his body a firm brace to keep her from falling. With a soft click of his tongue, he urged the horse forward, away from the square, away from the silent judgment of the town. He didn't look back. There was nothing there for him. His cabin was nestled in the foothills past a dry ridge, a place the world had agreed to overlook. The ride felt longer than it should have, each jostle of the horse a potential torment for the girl in his arms. He could feel the faint, unsure rhythm of her breathing against his chest, the fragile beat of a life that wasn't certain it was still living. When they arrived, the sun was beginning to dip below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and bruised purple. He didn't rush her inside. He eased her down from the saddle and helped her to the porch, letting her sit with her back against a sturdy wooden post, like a spooked fawn you didn't want to startle. The world had been a cage for her. He would not offer another. He went inside and returned with a tin cup of water from the well. He knelt before her and held it out. She stared at it for a long moment, as if she'd forgotten what it was, for what it felt like to drink. Then, with a shaking hand, she took the cup. Her fingers brushed his, and her skin was as cold as a stone from the bottom of a creek. She drank slowly, deliberately, each swallow a victory. That was enough for now. He sat on the porch steps across from her, the space between them filled with the chirping of crickets and the weight of unspoken things. The silence stretched, but it wasn't the empty silence of his solitude. It was a silence of assessment, of waiting. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough from disuse. "You got a name?" She looked up, her gaze meeting his from under the curtain of her hair. She gave a small, hesitant nod. Clara. It was a simple name spoken so quietly it was nearly lost to the evening breeze. Clara. Rhett didn't press for more. He could see the story etched into her skin, written in the hollows of her eyes. This wasn't just about a town's cruelty. The cross around her neck, so like Lily's, was a detail too precise for coincidence. That wasn't injustice. That was a message. It was a stone thrown into the still deep pool of his past, and the ripples were only now beginning to reach the shore. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the people who had stayed quiet that day hadn't forgotten her. And sooner or later, they would come looking to bury her in their silence for good. For 2 days, Rhett's world shrank to the size of the small cabin and the fragile life within it. His single-minded purpose was keeping Clara alive. He was methodical, his hands once used to the cold steel of a gun, now surprisingly gentle. He cleaned her wounds with water and carbolic soap, his touch careful and impersonal. He spoon-fed her thin broth, watching her swallow with a patient focus, seeing the life flicker and then steady in her eyes. Her chest rose and fell in a rhythm that, to his relief, grew stronger with each passing hour. She slept most of the time deep, exhaustive sleeps that seemed to be purging the poison of her ordeal. When she was awake, she rarely spoke, but her eyes followed him. They were clearer now, the glassy emptiness, replaced by a watchful intelligence like embers glowing under a layer of ash. She watched him chop wood, mend a leather strap, clean his rifle. She was studying him, trying to understand the man who had cut her down when the rest of the world had left her to hang. On the evening of the 3rd day, a knock came at the cabin door. 3 sharp, heavy raps that sounded less like a request and more like a demand. Rhett paused, his hand halfway to the pot of coffee on the stove. He glanced at Clara, who was sitting up in the cot he'd given her, her body instantly tense. He gave her a minute nod, a silent promise, before moving to the door. He opened it to find Levi Harrow standing on his porch. Levi was a big man, gone to seed around the middle, with a thick, drooping mustache that hid a perpetual sneer. His eyes were like boiled stones, hard and opaque. He used to be Rhett's deputy, a man who had shown promise before the town's corruption had seeped into his bones. Now he was little more than an errand boy for whoever held power, his days fueled by whiskey and resentment. "Town's asking questions," Rhett Levi said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't look at Rhett, his gaze fixed on a point over his shoulder. "About that girl?" Rhett didn't blink. He leaned against the doorframe, blocking the entrance. "Let them ask." Levi shifted his weight, the porch boards groaning in protest. He took a half step closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Sheriff Calloway ain't too happy. Says you're meddling in official town business." Rhett's hand rested on the doorframe, inches from the stock of the rifle propped just inside. "Tell the sheriff if he wants to talk, he can ride up here himself. He knows the way." A short, ugly snort escaped Levi. That old lawman's spine broke years ago. He doesn't come calling himself anymore. He sends boys now. Boys with matches and bad tempers. The threat hung in the air, thick and oily. Rhett's eyes narrowed. "You tell whoever sent you that this is my property. The next person who comes knocking uninvited better have a damn good reason for living." He shut the door firmly in Levi's face, the sharp sound echoing the finality of his words. He turned back to the room. Clara was sitting straighter than before, her hands clenched into fists on the thin blanket. She had heard everything. She looked at Rhett, and for the first time since he'd met her, there was no fear in her eyes. There was only a cold, hard fire. "I didn't steal anything." She said, her voice quiet, but ringing with a strength he hadn't heard before. "It was the mayor's son, Marcus Thompson. He finds girls who have no one. He tried to take what he wanted from me behind the mercantile. I fought back. I scratched his face. To protect his pride, he claimed I'd tried to rob him." She took a shaky breath. His father, Mayor Thompson, believed him without question. Or he pretended to. Rhett's jaw tightened. He knew Mayor Thompson. a man whose smile was as polished as his silver-tipped cane, and whose soul was as rotten as a dead tree. Thompson ruled Bod not with laws, but with favors and fear. Of course, he would protect his son. A public shaming of a nameless girl was a small price to pay for maintaining the family's pristine image. The town had buried its guilt under a lie, and now it wanted to burn the evidence. He knew what had to be done. The quiet life he had built for himself was over. They had thrown the stone. Now they would have to deal with the wave. He walked over to his cot, knelt down, and reached into the dark space beneath it. His fingers brushed against a dusty wooden box. He pulled it out and lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was his old badge. A simple silver star dented on one edge from a long-forgotten scuffle. He picked it up, its weight familiar in his palm. He didn't wipe the dust off. He didn't need to. Sometimes justice doesn't need to shine. It just needs to show up. Rhett rode into town at first light, the rising sun at his back, casting a long, imposing shadow before him. He wore no coat, and the old rifle was in its scabbard, not brandished. But clipped to the worn leather of his belt was the faded badge, its tarnished silver, a stark proclamation. And behind him, sitting tall and straight on a mare he'd borrowed from his own small stable, rode Clara. Her hair was clean and tied back with a piece of twine. Her chin was lifted just enough to declare she was not a victim seeking pity, but a woman demanding truth. The streets were quiet, unnaturally so. The usual morning bustle was absent. Faces peeked from behind parted shutters and cracked doors, their eyes following the duo's slow progression down the main street. That's the thing about guilt. It's loud in private whispers and deathly silent in public. Rhett reined Ghost to a halt directly in front of the courthouse, the very heart of the town's authority. Leaning against a rain barrel, picking at his nails with a pocket knife, was Marcus Thompson. He was a young man, sculpted from his father's arrogance, with a clean shirt, polished boots, and a smirk as oily as a frying pan. When he saw them, the smirk widened. Well, look what the old dog dragged in. Marcus drawled, his voice carrying in the still air. You bring her back to finish what she started, Callahan. Or maybe apologize for her lies. Rhett dismounted with a slow, deliberate grace. He didn't look at Marcus. His attention was on Clara as he helped her down from her horse. She stood beside him, steady and calm. Then she reached into the pocket of the simple dress Rhett's wife had made for Lily years ago, a dress he had kept packed away. She pulled out a small object and held it out on her palm for all to see. It was a silver brooch, a simple design of a swooping bird, now bent nearly in half. Dried dark blood crusted one edge. This was mine. Clara said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the silence. A gift from my mother. He took it from me that night. He must have dropped it when I fought back. She looked directly at Marcus, her gaze unwavering. You can lie about my motives, Marcus, but you can't lie about your own greed. A crowd was starting to form now, drawn by the confrontation they had all secretly craved. One by one, faces appeared, shopkeepers, ranch hands, even the preacher, his Bible clutched in his hand like a shield. They emerged from the shadows, their curiosity overriding their fear. Mayor Thompson pushed through the gathering, his face florid, his chest puffed out with indignation. He was a man accustomed to his authority being absolute, and the sight of Rhett Callahan wearing a badge was an affront he could not tolerate. You have no authority here, Rhett, the mayor boomed, pointing a trembling finger. That badge is a relic. You are a civilian, interfering in the lawful business of this town. Rhett finally turned his gaze, sweeping over the assembled faces, lingering on each one for a beat. He held up his hand, not to show the badge, but to command their attention. He's right. Rhett said, his voice calm and level. I don't have his kind of authority. All I have is the truth. He pointed a finger not at Marcus, but at the crowd itself. And I have 30 people who are about to decide which side they're on. He let his words hang in the air, a challenge and a choice. You all watched her hang. He continued, his voice dropping lower, each word landing like a stone. You let it happen because it was easier than asking a question. Because his name is Thompson and hers is not. But now you're going to listen. She didn't steal a thing. He did. And when she said no, he built a lie to save his pride, and you all backed it with your silence. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the square. No one moved. No one spoke. The townspeople looked at each other, at the mayor, at the defiant girl, and the ghost of a lawman who stood with her. Then a figure detached itself from the crowd. It was Levi Harrow. The old deputy stepped forward, his face a mask of weary resignation. He didn't say a word. He just took off his dusty hat, crushed the brim in his big hands, and came to stand beside Clara. It was a small act, but it broke the dam. An old rancher whose son Rhett had once saved from a cattle stampede stepped forward next. Then two more men miners with soot on their faces and shame in their eyes. A line was being drawn, not in the dust, but in the conscience of a town. Rhett didn't smile. He just gave a single sharp nod. He wasn't there to punish. He was there to make damn sure that a person's worth wasn't decided by their name or their connections. He was there to make sure nobody ever forgot. Justice wasn't always about revenge. Sometimes it was about standing where no one else would, until others found the courage to stand with you. Clara looked up at Rhett, her eyes shining with something more powerful than gratitude. It was understanding. She had been seen. Her truth had been heard. And in that moment, before the mayor could muster another word of blustering denial, Rhett knew this was not the end. It was the beginning of a much deeper, darker fight. With the town's silent verdict delivered, the tension in the square finally broke. Mayor Thompson, seeing the tide of public opinion turn against him, sputtered with impotent rage before grabbing his son by the arm and dragging him back toward the safety of his office, his retreat more damning than any confession. The crowd began to disperse, the people melting back into their shops and homes, their faces etched with a quiet shame that would linger for days. Before they left, Rhett walked over to where Marcus had stood. He looked at the spot, then at the assembled few who remained, Levi, the old rancher, the miners. He wasn't looking for their approval. He was making a point. He then turned and walked up the courthouse steps. He unclipped the old badge from his belt and pinned it to the courthouse door, right through a wanted poster. It was a statement. He wasn't the law, but for one morning, the law had returned to Bod. He and Clara mounted their horses. As they rode out of town, she moved her horse closer to his. "What you did back there?" She started, her voice soft. "No one has ever stood up for me like that." Rhett just looked ahead at the open country stretching before them. "Everyone deserves someone in their corner," he said gruffly. It was the closest he could come to explaining the tangled knot of duty memory and regret that had driven him. They rode back to the cabin, the silence between them now comfortable, companionable. The quiet road felt like a path to a different world, far removed from the poisoned atmosphere of the town. The next morning, Clara was down by the creek. Rhett had been wrong. It hadn't dried up completely. A small, persistent trickle of water still flowed over the smooth stones, a testament to the life that endures even in the harshest of lands. She had taken off her boots and was letting the cool water run over her feet. "You ever feel like you get a second shot at living?" she asked, not looking at him as he approached with an armload of firewood. Rhett stopped, lowering the wood to the ground. He watched the steady flow of the creek, thinking of the 9 years he had spent in a waking death. Every damn day, he said the words, carrying more weight than she could know. The days that followed settled into a new kind of rhythm. A week passed, and then another. It was a time of quiet healing. Clara, it turned out, had a knack for fixing things. She repaired a wobbly porch board, stitched a tear in his canvas shirt with neat, even stitches, and even found a way to coax a few stubborn vegetables from the dry soil in his neglected garden patch. Rhett, in turn, found himself speaking more, telling her small stories of the land, of tracking a mountain lion, of the way the stars looked on a moonless night. They didn't talk about justice or revenge. They didn't talk about the Thompsons or the town. Some wounds don't need constant retelling. They just need time and good hands and the quiet space to heal. Rhett found himself smiling at nothing in particular, a foreign feeling that settled oddly on his face. Clara started humming a low, sweet tune when the wind picked up in the afternoons. It wasn't romance. It wasn't the story of a rescuer and his ward. It was something quieter, deeper. It was respect, hard-won and freely given. Two broken people finding a way to piece themselves back together in the stillness of the desert. But the peace was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over deep, cold water. Rhett's investigation hadn't ended in the town square. It had only begun. At night, after Clara was asleep, he would sit by the fire piecing together the fragments of what he knew. Thompson's immediate vicious condemnation of Clara, the way he had used her as a public spectacle. It felt personal. It felt like it was aimed at something more than just a vagrant girl. He began making quiet trips not into Bod, but around it. He spoke to a grizzled old doctor who lived on the outskirts, a man who owed Rhett for keeping his drunkard son out of jail years ago. Doc Hemlock confirmed Clara's story. He had been called to the mayor's house the night of the alleged theft to treat Marcus's face. Deep scratches, the doctor had mumbled, swirling amber liquid in a glass. Looked like a cornered cat had gotten a hold of him. The mayor paid me extra to say it was from a fall. Told me the girl was a thief and would be dealt with. Rhett also learned something more disturbing. Mayor Thompson had been quietly buying up failed ranches and dry claim mines all around the territory, including a significant parcel of land that bordered Rhett's own isolated property. Why would a man of his wealth and power want a collection of worthless, sun-scorched dirt? His unease grew when Levi Harrow rode up to his cabin one afternoon, looking over his shoulder the entire way. He dismounted, his face grim. "You stirred the nest," Rhett Levi said, his voice low. "Thompson's not letting this go. He's putting the word out that you're unstable. A dangerous man, harboring a criminal." "Let him talk," Rhett said, cleaning his rifle. "It's more than talk," Levi insisted. He leaned closer. "There's something you don't know about the mayor. It goes back a long way. Back to the day Lily, the day of the accident." Levi's eyes were filled with a pained memory. "Thompson holds you responsible for more than just his boy's embarrassment. He holds a grudge that's been festering for 9 years. Before Rhett could press him for more, Levi shook his head, a flicker of fear in his eyes. "That's all I can say. Just watch your back. This isn't about his son. This is about you." Levi mounted up and rode off, leaving Rhett standing in a cloud of dust and chilling realization. The framing of Clara hadn't been a random act of cruelty. The cross around her neck hadn't been a coincidence. It was a lure. Mayor Thompson had dangled a piece of Rhett's own broken past in front of him, knowing he wouldn't be able to resist. This whole affair had been a carefully constructed trap, designed to draw him out of his 9 years of isolation and into a confrontation Thompson had been planning for nearly a decade. The why was still a ghost, but the who was now terrifyingly clear. And Rhett had walked right into it. The fragile peace of the cabin was shattered. The knowledge that Thompson's actions were a deliberate trap, a personal vendetta aimed squarely at him, changed everything. The air grew thick with unspoken tension. Rhett became more watchful, his gaze constantly scanning the ridge lines, his hand never far from the Colt peacemaker on his hip. He was no longer just protecting Clara. He was standing in the crosshairs of a patient, powerful enemy. One evening, as the sun bled its final colors across the hills, Clara found him sitting on the porch, staring into the gathering dark. She sat down beside him, her presence a quiet offering of support. "Do you think folks like us ever get to write our own endings?" she asked, her voice barely disturbing the twilight. Rhett took a long, slow breath, the cold desert air filling his lungs. He thought of the life he'd planned, the one that had died with Lily. He thought of the 9 years of empty pages that followed. "Maybe we don't get to write the beginning," he said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur. "But we sure as hell get to decide the last page." His words were a promise to her and to himself. Thompson had started this story, but Rhett would be the one to finish it. The mayor did not wait long to escalate. His response was as swift as it was insidious. He couldn't attack Rhett directly, not yet. An open assault on a man with Rhett's reputation, even a faded one, would raise too many questions. Instead, Thompson used the most potent weapon he had: the law. A few days after Levi's warning, Sheriff Calloway, flanked by 2 nervous-looking deputies Rhett didn't recognize, rode up the path to the cabin. They stopped a good 30 yards away, their reluctance a palpable thing. Rhett Calloway called out, his voice thin and reedy. I have a warrant for your arrest." Rhett stepped out onto the porch, Clara right behind him. He held his rifle loosely in one hand, its barrel pointed at the ground. A warrant for what? Calloway shifted in his saddle, unable to meet Rhett's gaze. He unrolled a piece of paper with a flourish that failed to hide the tremor in his hands. For assault on Marcus Thompson and for harboring a known fugitive. The fugitive was cleared in front of the whole town. Rhett stated, his voice dangerously calm. "And as for the assault, your own eyes told you what happened. The mayor has new witnesses," Calloway stammered. "People who now recall you attacking young Marcus without provocation. It's all official. I have to take you in, Rhett. It's my job." Rhett knew a lie when he heard one. Thompson had coerced or paid for his witnesses, twisting the narrative to fit his needs. He was using the sheriff as a pawn, the badge as a weapon. "You know what this is," Calloway, Rhett said, his eyes boring into the sheriff. "You know it's a sham." "My hands are tied," the sheriff pleaded, his face a mask of sweaty desperation. "Just come in peacefully. We can sort it out." "There's nothing to sort out," Rhett said. He raised the rifle slightly. "You and your men are on my land. I suggest you leave." The deputies exchanged nervous glances, their hands hovering over their sidearms. But Calloway had no stomach for a fight, especially not with Rhett Callahan. He was a man who managed conflict by avoiding it. With a defeated sigh, he nodded to his men. "Let's go. But this warrant stands, Rhett. You're officially an outlaw." They turned their horses and retreated, leaving the warrant and its threat hanging in the air. Rhett and Clara were now fugitives. The small cabin, once a sanctuary, had become a cage. They couldn't stay. Thompson would send a full posse next, and he wouldn't send a coward like Calloway to lead it. That night, they packed what little they could, water-dried jerky ammunition and a single warm blanket. Under the cover of a moonless sky, they led their horses away from the cabin and into the jagged, broken country of the Badlands. It was a desolate landscape of canyons and rock formations, a place where a man could disappear if he knew the terrain. And Rhett knew it, like the lines on his own hand. For days they moved like ghosts, traveling at night and hiding during the brutal heat of the day. They spoke little, the silence of the wilderness, a constant companion. But in that silence, a bond of trust forged in shared adversity deepened between them. Rhett taught Clara how to read the land, how to find water, how to move without leaving a trace. She in turn proved to be a quick study, her resilience a quiet marvel. Her fear had been burned away, replaced by a steely resolve. One night, huddled by a small smokeless fire in a hidden alcove, Clara tended to a cut on Rhett's arm he'd gotten from a thorny brush. "He won't stop, will he?" she said, her voice soft but certain. "Mayor Thompson. He'll hunt us until he has you." "No," Rhett replied, watching the flames. "He won't." He finally understood the depth of Thompson's hatred. This wasn't just about putting him in a cell. This was about destroying him. Thompson wanted to strip him of his freedom, his name, and finally his life. The mayor's plan was to lure him back to town for a final public humiliation and execution. And in that moment, Rhett knew he couldn't keep running. To run was to let Thompson win, to let him write the final page of his story. He had to turn and face the man who had haunted him for 9 years. He had to go back to Bod. He's planned a party, Rhett said, a grim realization dawning. Founders' Day is next week. The whole town will be there. It's a perfect stage for him. He'll want to finish this in front of everyone to make an example of me. Clara looked at him, her eyes wide. You can't go back. It's a trap. It's always been a trap, Rhett said. But this time I'll be the one setting it. He looked at her, his expression resolute. I'm going to expose him. For what he did to you and for whatever it is that's been driving this 9-year vendetta. But I can't do it alone. Clara didn't hesitate. She finished tying the bandage around his arm and met his gaze, her own resolve, a mirror of his. Tell me what we need to do. Founders' Day in Bod was a mandatory celebration, a spectacle orchestrated by Mayor Thompson to display his beneficence and control. The town square was festooned with bunting, and a stage had been erected in front of the courthouse. But an unnatural tension hung in the air, thick as the dust kicked up by the wind. The warrant for Rhett Callahan's arrest was common knowledge, and the whispers about his defiance had turned the festival into a wake. As afternoon bled into a bruised twilight, the sky to the west began to curdle, turning a sickly yellow-gray. A storm was coming. The wind picked up, whipping dust into swirling devils that danced down the main street, a grim omen. Rhett and Clara slipped back into town under the cover of the growing storm, using the chaos of the wind and the distraction of the celebration to their advantage. Their plan was simple and desperate: confront Thompson publicly inside the courthouse, where the town's most important records, including land deeds, were kept. Rhett suspected Thompson's land grabbing was connected to his vendetta, a final piece of the puzzle. They made their way to the rear of the courthouse. Inside, the celebration had moved indoors to escape the wind. Through a grimy window, they could see the main chamber filled with the town's elite, led by Mayor Thompson, who was holding court near the judge's bench. Sheriff Calloway stood nervously by the door, and near him, looking deeply uncomfortable, was Levi Harrow. Just as Rhett found an unlocked side door, the storm broke. It wasn't rain. It was a wall of sand and wind that slammed into Bod with the force of a physical blow. The sky went dark. A terrifying roar filled the air as the sandstorm engulfed the town, reducing visibility to near zero and turning the world outside into a maelstrom. The heavy oak doors of the courthouse banged shut, trapping everyone inside. This was it. The stage was set. Rhett pushed the side door open and stepped into the room, Clara at his side. The sudden appearance of the town's most wanted man sent a shockwave through the assembled crowd. Conversations died. A woman gasped. Sheriff Calloway's hand went to his gun, but he froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. Callahan Mayor Thompson bellowed, his face contorting with a mixture of fury and triumph. You are a fool to show your face here, Sheriff. Arrest this man. It's over, Thompson. Rhett said, his voice cutting through the rising howl of the wind outside. This ends tonight. He strode toward the center of the room, his gaze locked on the mayor. This was never about a stolen brooch. This was about me. Thompson laughed, a chilling, humorless sound. You always were arrogant. But yes, you're right. This has always been about you. He stepped forward, his polished civility stripped away, revealing the raw, burning hatred beneath. It's about 9 years ago. The day you let my son die. A collective gasp went through the room. Rhett felt a jolt, as if struck by lightning. Thompson's son, my boy Samuel, was with your daughter that day. Thompson spat, his voice trembling with long-suppressed grief and rage. They were playing near the old silver mine. You were the sheriff. You were supposed to keep this town safe, but you were incompetent. A coward. The mine collapsed. Your girl was killed, and my Samuel, my only son, was lost in the cave-in because you were too slow, too inept to save him. You cost me everything, Callahan, and I swore on his grave that I would take everything from you. The truth hit Rhett with the force of a physical blow. The framing of Clara, a girl with a passing resemblance to Lily wearing a similar cross, it was all a sick, cruel pageant designed to reopen Rhett's oldest wound before Thompson destroyed him completely. So you tormented an innocent girl? Rhett's voice was a low growl. You used my grief to feed your own hate. She was a means to an end, that Thompson roared. A way to finally bring the great Rhett Callahan to his knees, and now you will pay. You'll be tried and hanged for your crimes right here in the town. You failed. As Thompson's men started to move their hands on their guns, a voice cut through the tension. It wasn't his fault, Mayor. All eyes turned to Levi Harrow. The former deputy stepped forward, his face pale, but his eyes resolved. He looked from Thompson to Rhett, his expression one of profound regret. I was there that day, Levi said, his voice heavy. I was the first one on the scene. It wasn't your fault, Rhett. And it wasn't a simple collapse. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the confession of a 9-year silence finally spilling out. The children, they weren't just playing. They found something. A vein of silver richer than anyone had ever seen. Old man Hemmings, the prospector, he was there too. He saw them find it. He wanted it for himself. He set a small charge of dynamite at the mouth of the mine, trying to scare them off. But it was too much. It brought the whole entrance down. The room was utterly silent, save for the screaming wind outside. Hemmings ran. Levi continued, his voice cracking. He confessed it all to me years later on his deathbed. Begged me not to tell anyone for fear of what you would do to him, Mayor. I was a coward. I kept my mouth shut. He looked directly at Thompson, his eyes pleading. Rhett got there as fast as any man could. He tried to dig them out with his bare hands. It wasn't incompetence that cost you your son. It was greed. And a tragic, terrible accident. The revelation hung in the air, a devastating truth that shattered the foundations of both men's worlds. Thompson stared at Levi, his face, a canvas of disbelief, slowly crumbling into horror. His 9-year crusade for vengeance, the intricate web of hate he had woven, was all built on a lie. His son's death wasn't the fault of a failed lawman. It was the result of a meaningless, sordid crime, broken by the truth. Thompson let out a strangled cry, a sound of pure agony. His face, stripped of its righteous fury, was now just that of a grieving father. In his despair, his hand shot inside his coat, pulling out a small silver derringer. But he didn't point it at Rhett. He didn't point it at anyone. His eyes were wild, lost in a storm of his own, making a man with nothing left to lose. In the aftermath, the storm outside and the storm inside the courthouse both subsided, leaving a heavy, exhausted calm. Thompson, disarmed by a suddenly decisive Sheriff Calloway, did not resist. He collapsed into a chair, a broken man, the weight of his misplaced hate having finally crushed him. He was taken into custody, not as a powerful mayor, but as a shattered soul who had orchestrated a cruel campaign of revenge for a tragedy he had misunderstood. As the sand settled outside, revealing a world scoured clean, the townspeople who had been trapped in the courthouse filed out their faces, a mixture of shock and shame. They offered clumsy, averted apologies to Clara, whose name was now irrevocably cleared. She accepted them with a quiet dignity that spoke more loudly than any words of condemnation. Rhett approached Sheriff Calloway, who was standing by the door, looking older and smaller than he had an hour before. You did the right thing in the end, Calloway, Rhett said, his voice devoid of anger. Calloway nodded, not meeting his eyes. He had a hold on all of us. I'm sorry, Rhett. Rhett reached up and unpinned the tarnished badge from the door. He held it for a moment, then pressed it into the sheriff's hand. The town's going to need a real lawman now. Try to be him. He didn't wait for a reply, turning to leave. His last conversation in town was with Thompson. He found him in a holding cell staring at the stone wall. Rhett stood on the other side of the bars. There was no victory, no satisfaction. There was only a profound, shared sorrow. All those years, Thompson whispered, his voice hollow. All that hate. It was all for nothing. It was for our children, Rhett said quietly. We grieved in different ways. Your way cost more. He paused and then reached into his pocket. At the mine after the collapse, he had found something in the rubble, something he'd never understood. A small, tarnished silver locket. He now knew it must have belonged to Samuel. He placed it on the small shelf outside the cell. This was his. Rhett turned and walked away, leaving Thompson alone with his ghosts. The next morning, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Clara stood on the porch of the cabin, a small bundle of her belongings at her feet. She was wearing a sturdy traveling dress she had bought in town with the last of her own money. You don't have to go, Rhett said, though he knew she did. Yes, I do, she replied, a small, genuine smile on her face. You gave me back my name, Rhett. Now I need to go find a life to go with it. She stepped forward and gave him a brief, firm hug. Thank you for seeing me. He nodded, unable to speak. He watched as she mounted her horse and rode away, not looking back, her figure growing smaller and smaller, until she was just a speck on the horizon, heading toward a future she would write herself. Later that day, Rhett made one final journey. He rode to the small windswept cemetery on the hill overlooking Bod. 2 graves lay side by side, marked by simple wooden headstones. One read, Lily Callahan. The other, weathered and almost illegible, read, Samuel Thompson. He knelt between them. From his saddlebag, he took the small hand-carved wooden cross that Clara had returned to him. With a thumb that remembered the feel of the wood, he gently pushed it into the earth at the base of Lily's headstone. Then he took out the tarnished silver locket and placed it on the ground in front of Samuel's grave. It was an offering, a quiet treaty between 2 grieving fathers, an end to the cycle of revenge. He stood the wind tugging at his coat. For the first time in 9 years, the crushing weight on his soul felt lighter. He had not found happiness, not yet. But he had found something far more, elusive peace. The past was no longer a ghost that haunted him. It was simply a story that had been told. He returned to his cabin, not as a man in exile, but as a man who was finally home. The next morning, he stood on his porch and watched the sunrise paint the desert in shades of gold and rose. He was no longer a man haunted by what he had lost, but a man finally free to live in the quiet beauty of the present.